registrants we
Sorry about that.
had. Based on the number of folks that we had signing up for this, I think that it's probably safe to say that this is a topic that is very relevant currently and very much on a lot of folks' minds, and in many ways for good reason. School refusal or school avoidance has been certainly an issue in schools since schools have been created. It's not something that's new to our current period of time, but one of the things that we have seen over the last few years is an interesting wave in this area where, prior to the pandemic, there was already an increasing number of cases of kids expressing a great deal of anxiety around attending school and a great deal of anxiety about staying in school. Then the pandemic hit and everybody went on to remote learning for a period of time and sheltering in place. And what we had at that point in time, based on the research, was sort of a kind of a split in our broader culture where folks who had greater access to technology and greater ability within their home to set up school spaces for their kids ended up having relatively good attendance at school, and a lot of kids who experienced social anxiety and school anxiety during those early days of the pandemic when they were doing school from home. All of a sudden it was like everything was great and they had very little difficulties getting to their Zoom in the morning. They rolled out of bed, they clicked on their camera, and there they were with their school, but they didn't have to actually get out of their house to go to school. The folks that had less access to that, in many ways it became very much an equity issue in our culture. Folks who had multiple kids vying for one computer, or no internet access, or parents working from home at the same time kids are working from home, so the parents didn't have the opportunity to oversee some of the instruction. The split became less about anxiety of attending school, but much more of an issue of access and equity. And then more recently, as schools have begun opening up for in-person learning again, what we've seen is a significant spike beyond what we were seeing pre-pandemic in terms of kids avoiding school and kids expressing a great deal of anxiety around school. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the research on this, what we're seeing. I'm going to talk to you about why we think this is happening, and also talk about some proven techniques that seem to be useful in addressing it. And so I'm going to share with you guys a screen. Oops, it started at the end of the presentation rather than the beginning. So let's see if we can get you back to the beginning here. So what we're going to talk about, as I said, is school refusal and school avoidance. We're going to start off with a little bit of discussion around some definitions that are often tossed around, some words that describe this problem, but also some words that sometimes are used that really aren't relevant to what's going on. So we'll start with a little bit of nomenclature so that we all have a shared understanding of what we're talking about. We'll talk a little bit about what the current statistics are showing, as well as the predictions from public health experts. We're going to spend a little bit of time about what seems to be the function of the behavior. And what I mean by that, I'll go into more detail about this later, but when psychologists are trying to explore what is happening with a child when they're exhibiting symptoms of anxiety or symptoms of depression or any other psychological factors, one of the things we spend time doing is to try to understand what is the child attempting to accomplish through the symptoms that they're demonstrating. And so we do what is termed a functional behavioral analysis, or an analysis of what is maintaining the behavior. And so we'll talk about what the research is suggesting in terms of what seems to be the function. We'll talk about some of the symptoms you might be seeing right now with your children. We'll spend some time on what to do about it. And we're going to really divvy that up in terms of four main components. What is the parent's role in addressing this? What is the school's role? What is the outside clinician's role? And then one that I didn't put in here, but also what is the child's role? So there's going to be four pieces we focus on: parent, school, clinician, and child. And then we'll wrap it up with some conclusions. So hopefully that addresses what you came here for. If you do have questions as we're going through, it's hard for me sometimes to keep an eye on the chat function, although that's obviously one way you can put questions in there. And I know Mark often keeps an eye on that. So if you have questions, you can type them into the chat function, or just feel free to click on your audio and say, Chris, and I'll stop and answer whatever questions you have, okay? So let's start so that we have a shared understanding of what we're talking about. Various terms that get thrown around in the literature are school avoidance, school refusal, school phobia, and truancy, to explain why kids sometimes don't show up at school. The definition for school avoidance and school refusal really are two words that mean pretty much the same thing. What we're talking about there is the child resisting going to school because of significant anxiety or worry that is keeping them from being able to get out of school, out of the house in the morning, get to school and stay in school. So on a continuum, this is generally seen, the school avoidance, school refusal piece is seen as kind of, school avoidance is just the kids who might avoid on a more periodic basis, not as much of a fixed pattern. School refusal is slightly further down the continuum, although they're often used interchangeably, but school refusal is when the child gets into a pattern of refusing to go pretty much every day. School phobia is a clinical definition that is representative of an actual anxiety disorder where even the thought of school puts the child into a panic state. And the child has such physical and emotional reactions to the concept of school, and getting into a school building triggers off such a huge anxiety response that it's termed an actual phobic response. The child really at that point needs much more significant levels of intervention to be able to manage what is going on with them psychologically and physically. And then the other category that's sometimes thrown around is actually a legal term of truancy. And this really is not what we're talking about today. Truancy, more often than not, is a child refusing to go to school or just avoiding school, mainly because they want to hang out with their friends, or they want to spend time doing, sitting in a park, doing something much more enjoyable, or it's part of a broader conduct disorder that they are, basically opposing any rules that are placed on them. And it's actually much more, as I said, a legal term. And more often than not, where the theory is that there often are psychological roots to it and psychological reasons that trigger it off. This has gotten much more into a legal rule-breaking pattern, and is often dealt with in more of a working with the school truancy officers and working with family courts and things like that. So we're not going to spend as much time talking about that, but what we are going to talk about are these areas of school avoidance and refusal. And some of the main root causes are what in psychology world we call GAD, or generalized anxiety disorder, which is a broad-based feeling of anxiety across a variety of different situations, but that oftentimes plays out in a school setting. Social anxiety, a fear of being in social situations, a fear of initiating social interactions, fear of embarrassment over I'm not going to be able to keep a conversation going. So a social anxiety is more of an interpersonal anxiety. Separation anxiety is a fear of separating from a caretaker, typically a parent, sometimes a nanny. And performance anxiety is like a test anxiety, or a fear of getting onto a sports field, or a situation where the person feels like the focus is going to be on them, and a great fear that they're not going to be able to perform up to what the expectations are. And so these are the typical main underlying root psychological causes for it. But one of the areas that's been relatively under research or under noticed over the years, but we've now begun taking a peek at much more, is this area of bullying, and how bullying very often is a piece that triggers off an avoidance or a refusal response. And so the reason for that not having come to the attention of psychologists and mental health practitioners earlier to such a degree as it currently is predominantly because of the nature of bullying. Most kids who are going through a bullying situation very often are almost embarrassed about it. They feel like there's something that they have brought to the table that is causing their peers or a peer to be treating them in this way, or something that they feel is wrong with them, that they're not able to stand up for themselves properly. And then oftentimes when they talk about it with a teacher or a parent, very often, it's not that the response from the adult is not caring and supportive, but very often it's, just go talk to, just tell your teacher about it, or, just ignore them and walk away from them. Don't worry about it. It's going to go away. It's sometimes downplayed in terms of the difficulty that the child is having in knowing how to handle it properly. And so very often kids internalize this and start creating all of these reasons why they can't get to school, for physical reasons or separation reasons or things like that. But when you really dig deep into it, what sometimes you do start to uncover is that this started because the child is avoiding a peer or a group of peers that they feel great fear about. And once you're able to discover that and systemically with the school, be able to begin addressing the issues underlying that, the child is able to start attending school and feel pretty good about the fact that they were able to handle it. So I just put that on the radar as something that I think, unfortunately, has taken us in the mental health field way too long to realize the potential contributing role of bullying in this situation. So let me throw some statistics at you guys. Anybody who knows my presentations knows I love going to the research and I love going to the brain. Those are my two favorite places to resort to when I have a presentation. And I like going to the research because it very often tips our hat in the direction of what we need to do about this. And the reason I titled the presentation "An Epidemic Within a Pandemic" is because what we're seeing over the last 20 years, 30 years, is an astronomical increase in the number of kids that are experiencing anxiety and avoidance around school. And so if you go back to the epidemiology, the rates of this, 30 years ago in 1990, we were really only targeting this as being around 1% to 2% of children as being having difficulty in this area. But flash forward to prior to the pandemic, and it was estimated as being about 5% of children were experiencing chronic issues with school refusal, school avoidance. Now, what the epidemiologists are saying, we're seeing as schools start reopening their doors to in-person learning, and what they're predicting we are going to see over the course of this year is possibly up to 15% of school-age children having challenges with getting to school on a consistent basis. And we're not talking about kids who need a mental health day. We're not talking about kids who want to avoid their math test on a Thursday, and so they wake up and say they've got a fever and they can't possibly get to school. We're not talking about these intermittent blips in the radar that pretty much every child at some point experiences a day that they just don't want to go to school. Every adult experiences a day they don't want to go to work or don't want to do something. That is absolutely normal and typical. What we're talking about from the standpoint of the epidemiology research currently is close to 1 out of every 6 kids, 6 or 7 kids that are experiencing significant levels of internal distress that are leading them on a more consistent basis to not be attending school on a consistent, sort of on a day-to-day, meeting their day-to-day demands. So, so that's the reason why we're saying this is potentially an epidemic within a pandemic. And what we're looking at is the possibility that The pandemic obviously didn't cause this, but the pandemic may have worsened it just by the nature of anxiety. And the basis for why I'm saying that is because what we know about anxiety is the more you're able to avoid what it is that you think is going to be difficult for you, the more challenging it gets. The slower you are to climb Mount Everest, the harder it's going to be to reach the top of that. And so what we see with children, what we see with any human being with anxiety, if you are able to avoid it, it gets better in the short term and it gets worse in the long term, and much worse in the long term, and becomes a fixed process by which you deal with the stress. You just keep avoiding to the point that you're never building the coping resources necessary to be able to get back into the patterns necessary. And so in the pandemic, when we absolutely needed to shelter in place and we had to go to remote learning, many kids were able to avoid some of their feared situations of meeting new peers, of taking tests, of having as much homework, of getting into social circumstances or performance situations that they felt concern over. And so by avoiding that, without us in any way having great options around that, it led to this possibility and what we're actually seeing of this increase over time. And so that's what this slide speaks to, is simply the cyclical nature of anxiety and the cyclical nature of avoidance, that you've got a kid who skips class because of anxiety caused by skipping too many classes. So it takes you through that loop of, if I avoid today, then my workload, my demand is going to increase tomorrow. So I'm going to avoid. The anxiety is going to get worse. I'm going to avoid more. I'm going to get all the way in this loop. And it starts becoming this insurmountable battle that you can't get through. So I mentioned earlier in the beginning, what is the function of the behavior? Why do kids seem to get into these patterns? And what psychologists love to do is we love to create procedures for letting the world know how important we are. And so we've created this whole thing called a functional behavior analysis. And this whole field of applied behavior analysis is based on the idea of doing functional behavior analyses to determine what are the functions of the different reasons that kids enter into some of these problematic behaviors. And so we have interviews with kids and interviews with parents and interviews with teachers, and we observe and we do all these different things, and we try to boil all the data down into what seems to be driving the behavior. And when you do multiple functional behavioral analyses of school refusal, on a rough level, these are what seems to be driving the behavior. So the first and most prominent one is, I would much rather not go to school because staying at home is a lot more fun. It's a lot more enjoyable to sit at home and watch YouTube videos, play video games, lie in my bed, play with my dog, have all these different snacks available to me. So access to preferred activities seems to be the main driver for many of the kids who actually get into some of these problematic patterns. About 1 in 3 kids, roughly an equal number of kids, goes to what I've been talking about of avoiding climbing Mount Everest, or what they perceive as Mount Everest. It's actually probably a little hill that they've got to climb, but in their brain, they see Mount Everest being equivalent to getting to school. And so they're avoiding negative emotions, the anxiety that comes up, that feeling of powerlessness, that feeling of helplessness, that feeling of there's no way I'm going to be able to do this. So I avoid it. By staying at home, that reduces my immediate experience of anxiety. I get through the day, and then next day, I have to avoid that even more. And so it gets in that loop we talked about. About 1 out of 4 kids are seeking attention from parents. So these are the kids that have a little bit of separation anxiety. They really have a very powerful bond in a positive way to their parent, but also in a way that can start to become problematic. And so the idea of separation from the parent becomes very fearful. And the attention that they're getting from the parent without the parent meaning to, the parent unwittingly starts to play into this relationship with the child, and they're able to get more and more attention from the parent by engaging in these avoidance behaviors of getting to school. And then about 1 out of 10, 1 out of every 9 students going through a school refusal pattern or escaping work demands. I don't want to take the math test. I don't want to go and see these kids at school. I don't want to go out and play baseball at the end of the day, so I'm going to avoid going to school. That way I don't have to do what it is my performance anxiety might be triggering off later in the day. So it's escaping work demands, escaping performance demands, or escaping social situations. So this is what the research is showing us as being the predominant root triggers and reasons for maintaining the behavior. And so when we talk about what are we going to do about it, those are the areas that we need to develop systems and integrated interventions to be able to address some of these issues. So before I jump into further stuff, I'm going to take a pause and have a sip of my seltzer, but any questions so far?
Can I ask, are you going to address the bullying more?
So what I will talk about as part of that is the role of the school in addressing some of these. And so we will touch on it there, yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
So before we jump into what do we do about it, let's talk a little bit about the difference between reasons why kids absolutely should miss school versus some of the reasons why, why as a parent and as a school and as a private clinician, why it's, when to intervene and say, no, you got to get yourself to school. So the main reason for a child to miss school is for any significant documented medical reason. We obviously don't want our kids going to school when they're sick. In this world of COVID and potential symptoms relating to COVID, it is absolutely critical that we not spread different germs and different viruses that are going to lead to further infections within school. So any one of these types of reasons would be an absolute understandable reason for why a child would stay home. So anything like persistent vomiting, bleeding, fever of greater than 100 degrees, severe diarrhea, blah, 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 blah. Flu-like symptoms. This is where you get into anything that could be a sign of COVID, obviously a higher fever, also potentially a symptom of COVID. So this is where you consult with the pediatrician, where you determine, is there a documented real medical reason for the child to miss school? And so if there is a medical symptom present, you absolutely endorse the idea of you're not going to school today, this is perfectly cool, you're staying at home. But with that, you're not necessarily putting into place the idea that staying at home is necessarily going to be like going to a spa. Okay, so when we talk about this, obviously, any physical ailment, you're going to want to set up a situation where your child's got lots of time to rest, fluids, all the different nurture and supports to help your child feel more comfortable. But it's not necessarily a play day, and it's certainly not a day where at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, if miraculously all the child's symptoms have disappeared, that the child can now do all of their after school activities without any question. That is where I think very often, many kids are quite adept at being able to present a variety of different profound symptoms that require them to stay home. And then roughly around 2 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it seems to lift. And that's where, as a parent, as any of the responsible adults, we need to make sure that we're not setting up a situation that without meaning to starts to become reinforcing for the child not being at school. So school refusal exists on a continuum, and it's down at this, the darker, the orangish into reddish areas that we really start to need to think about a collaborative model between the school, the parent, the child, and if you involve an outside professional working together to make sure that the child's issues are addressed. So where we obviously want all of our kids to exist is in these first 2 areas of school attendance on a day-to-day basis, or very minimal, periodic mental health days, not a big deal. just times where the child might need a little bit of time off. Nothing to really worry about if it's not becoming a pattern. But where it starts to get into a little bit more, a little bit more of a frequency, greater distress expressed by the child, and they're pleased for non-attendance. I can't get to school. I really don't want to go there. When you start to feel that intensity building, and when you start getting into persistent, either negative behaviors in the morning, frequent absences, frequent tardiness, skipping classes, missing part of the school day, leaving the school halfway through, spending the day in the school nurse's office, all of these different areas, this is the place where the earlier we intervene, the easier it is going to be to address the issue. And so if you start seeing these types of symptoms on a much more consistent basis, not once a month, not once even every few weeks, but pretty much on 2-3 times a week. If it happens frequently on a Monday when they're going back to school, or it happens on test days, or it happens on days where they've got significant social demands or significant other demands that might be putting stress on them. If you start seeing persistent tantrums, physical complaints, clingy behavior, chronic lateness, you can't get the kid out of bed in the morning, therefore you can't get them to school on time. And again, as I mentioned before, this is what nurses call frequent flyers. Frequent flyers are the kids that spend day after day in their office. Every day they find some reason to get down to the nurse's office. If you have a frequent flyer, those are the kids that we need to start addressing in a more consistent way. And so these should be the things you start looking out for as a parent, okay? And some of the barriers and influences that trigger this off, what I want to spend some time talking about here is the role that we as the adults sometimes play in the situation without knowing that we're playing into this. And so going back to what I've said several times, the more the child avoids the feared stimulus, getting into the school, sitting in class, going to classes that they might not like, the more the child avoids that, the more the pattern of school refusal increases. So if we as the adults, whether I'm a well-meaning teacher who lets the child leave early consistently, or lets the child consistently go down to the school nurse, or if I'm a parent that too easily lets the child stay home, or lets the child spend a day at home on a consistent basis, that's like spending time at a really wonderful spa or something like that, the more we make it too comfortable for the child to avoid their feared stimulus, that's where we're playing into this. And that's where what we notice in studying anxiety, we notice that there are various caregivers, almost more than 50% of the time, there are very often responses from caregivers that are well-meaning, are understandable why any caregiver, and I'm talking parent, teacher, even psychologist and a private psychologist, things like that, we all unwittingly sometimes play into this because we see the child's distress. And the child truly is, more often than not, feeling huge distress. And human beings are wired, this is where I make my brain pitch, as a caring adult in the world of a child. When we see a child in distress, we have brain synapses that are fired off that lead us to want to step in and do whatever we can to reduce the distress that the child is feeling. It is instinctual. It is absolutely necessary for our species to survive, for the brain to have these triggers as a caregiver to step in and to protect our child, or even the child in our care, if I'm a teacher or whatever, protect them from the distress that they're feeling. And so that's where we have the natural instinct to step in, to do things to soothe the child, to say, I understand, to give the child an out, to say, okay, you can stay home today, but tomorrow we're going to really tackle this. And then tomorrow comes and the anxiety attack is even greater. All right, we're going to give you one more day. Now, tomorrow, what are you going to do? We're going to get up on time. Everything's going to be okay, right? We're going to do this. Yep. Next day comes and it's even worse. It's natural to bond with the child to reduce the stress in the moment without understanding or without really thinking ahead to the idea that we're just going to have to climb a bigger mountain the next day. And so that overprotection trap is what we need to avoid. And it is so painful. It is so difficult as a parent to go through this. What I wanted to share with folks is something that's very, I think, probably one of the main reasons that I went into the field I went into. For any of you on the call who know me, you know that the fact that I now spend many of my days giving presentations to parent groups and teachers and stuff like that is a really bizarre choice for a professional career, because I had one of the most powerful panic disorders growing up. If the teacher called on me in class, I would immediately flush over. I would start having heart palpitations, and even to the point where on different times in class, I actually fainted. There was a point where I was an altar boy at my sister's wedding, and I started to have a panic attack, and I fainted on the altar there, and the priest had to carry me off the altar. True story, absolute reality. I had serious panic, and it began to impact me significantly in the school area in 6th grade, when I had Sister Gerald, who I'm sure she was a lovely, well-meaning person, but she scared the heck out of me. And in getting to school, it was a monumental feat for me. And I developed the ability to cause my body to go into fevers. I truly believe that I was able to bring fevers over myself so that I started to have more days where I was sick. Now, what didn't work here was that my mother was also a teacher in the school. So my mother was a 1st grade teacher in the school, and I was in 6th grade, and my mother couldn't miss school on a day-to-day basis, and dad was off for work and stuff like that. So what ended up happening is they said, you got to get up. If you're sick, that's okay, but we're going to bring you to school, and you got to go to school, and you're going to sit in the principal's office and you'll do your work there. And they didn't have any of these great interventions that they were following necessarily like that. It was out of the reality that I couldn't sit at home by myself, and so I had to get to school, and sitting in the principal's office was not terribly fun. And as scary as it was, they were able to at least get me across the threshold. And then slowly they built a relationship between Sister Gerald and I, so that I didn't have a panic response when I saw her. And I was able to get into class. And then I slowly over my life was able to start facing my fear of actually speaking up and talking in front of the group, and blah, blah, blah. Over different years, got to the point where speaking in front of a group is now no longer an issue for me. But it was all about the issue of taking steps into those feared moments, and the adults around me not accommodating for me and allowing me to be forced to face some of my distress and to sit with it and deal with it, and also have some methods in place to take little steps moving towards that. And that's one of the biggest pieces for intervention that we're going to spend some time talking about, is what's called exposure. Exposure treatment is, in a nutshell, it basically is about coming up with a list of, I can handle this. I can go to the school on a Saturday when there's nobody else there, and I can stay there for an hour. Okay, I can handle that. Now, what I can do is on a Thursday, I can go to school and I can spend 10 minutes in the hallway. And then next week, I go to school for 3 days. And next week, I go, and a hierarchy is building increasingly difficult pieces, but giving the child the skills to be able to handle that so that they can succeed and then face what is the next item on that hierarchy to keep them moving towards tolerating distress in a greater way. And without knowing it, my parents and my school set up a hierarchy, and they did not accommodate me by letting me sit at home and avoid my anxiety. And that's what got me through this, so that I didn't become a chronic school avoidance person. And so let's talk a little bit about the treatment. And so the treatment for this, as I said, needs to be integrated between the parent, the school, if you involve an outside professional, the outside professional, and the child. All 4 people have to be part of this, because if you don't have all 4 people on board, it doesn't mean that all four people, all four members are jumping for joy. It doesn't mean that the child is jumping for joy saying, yeah, I want to face this. I want to handle all of this. But if you don't have all four entities working together, the child's going to find the way through it, and it's going to become a bigger and a bigger issue. And so first, the role of the parents. Your first step in the process is you need to provide the clear expectation that school is not an option. School attendance is what the child's job is. You have the job to get to school 5 days a week. You have the job to get up in the morning. You have the job to get dressed, get out of the house, get to school, okay? So you need to be a family that provides the clear expectation of school attendance. And like anything as a parent, always lead with empathy. Always lead with, I know this is difficult. I know that this is really scary for, I know you're having a hard time this year. I know that this class scares you. I know that meeting new kids scares you. I know that this new building scares you. Lead with empathy. Let the child know you're there with them, but also the concept of encouraging and firmness. If this is where we're going to get to, you're going to be going to school every day, and I'm going to help you get there. But there's not the wishy-washy, there's not the outside exit doors. If you can't handle it, it's okay. We'll figure out something else, or we'll find a different school or whatever. It's built around the idea of encouragement and firmness of where we're going to get to. If it becomes a chronic and an overwhelming issue for you as a parent, seek out medical and mental health services. We've got great professionals in Fairfield County. We've got great folks within the schools. Reach out, and please don't do it on your own as a parent, okay? The first step in the path is going to be reaching out to the school and forming a partnership with them. And if you need to, there are other folks in our community that can help with this. And what they're going to help you with is what's called contingency management. And you're going to set up all of these different fun little interventions to help the child to be able to face the feared stimulus, to be able to help the child to increasingly approach what it is that's causing them this discomfort. And so you as the parent will be assisting the child in implementing what are called cognitive behavioral therapy treatment techniques. And cognitive behavioral therapy is just based around the idea, you've probably heard of CBT, but it's in a nutshell, it's based around the idea of identifying what are the negative thought patterns that the child is circling around in their head, identifying those negative thought patterns, identifying these core feelings or core values or core sentiments that are causing the child to feel stuck. So helping the child with maybe the help of a professional or a school psychologist, helping the child to identify what are those maintaining thoughts that are making it feel to the child like, I can't handle this. And then implementing things like breathing techniques, implementing strategies of, okay, I can face this first step and getting successful at the first step and then building a second step, implementing different reward systems, incentivizing the idea of when you get home from school, this is what the reward is going to be. Having a big reward at the end of the week that might be something the child would love to work towards. Establishing routines. Routines tend to be the things that help kids to be able to settle into a sense of predictability and a sense of I can handle this. So establish getting up in the same way every morning, what the dressing routine is, the breakfast routine, the evening, getting ready for bed, getting your book backpack, getting your clothes set out, having these routines in place. On the days that if the child truly is not getting out of the house, and we'll talk more about this, I've got a great slide later. And by the way, we will send out these slides to all of you guys as well. Make home as uncomfortable as possible if they do stay home. And the basics are absolutely no electronics, meaning no video games, no YouTube videos, no Instagram, no all of these fun things. And make sure that, if they have a snack in school, it's the exact same snack at home. They don't have free access to anything that they want. They've got to get up, they've got to get dressed, they've got to do work during the day, get work from school, and make sure that they've got work time. And as I said, in a later slide, I'm going to go through this in a lot more detail. reduce excessive child questioning. If your child keeps questioning you or seeking reassurance, say, you're going to be fine. It's okay. And just settle into either what's called planned ignoring of like, I answered that question, I'm not going to answer it again, and then just not responding, or minimal reassurance at that point. Don't inadvertently give lots of attention for the avoidance behavior. And as I said, increasing incentives for school attendance. Encourage healthy habits of exercise and involvement with peers, can make them have connections to their kids in their class so that they actually want to go see the kids in school, and communicate and collaborate effectively with the school and healthcare providers, okay? So these are the basic role of the parents in dealing with school refusal. Any questions there? And as I said, I have some good materials for you in a couple slides as well that'll go into even more detail on some of these things.
Chris, may I ask, what about the parents who are working and are not able to stay home and create that uncomfortable environment that you're talking about?
Great question. And so what I try to do in this situation is to, this is where it takes a village, okay? And this is where I try to identify, is there a grandparent? Is there an aunt or an uncle? Is there a neighbor? Is there anyone on the outside that you can partner with to have that person either come and spend time at home or stop in periodically at home? Or can your child actually go to their place and have basically their supervised, very limited reinforcement day in their environment and come up with whatever incredible reinforcers you need to have for that neighbor or that friend or that aunt or uncle or whatever, make sure you do something fun to take care of them. But if you can possibly involve somebody else who can step in and provide a little bit of that consistency and structure and oversight, that would be the ideal scenario. If there truly is nobody that exists in that, and you have to leave your child at home, and with the idea of this is not a free day to be doing whatever you need to be able to be doing, that's where there's no great solution in that area except the idea of making sure that you're limiting other other little benefits, like you're not going to soccer practice at the end of the day, or you're not playing in your next football game or whatever. On the weekend, you're going to be doing the schoolwork that you didn't do during the week, and I'm going to be supervising you on the weekend. So you try to provide whatever pieces that can add a little bit to the idea of you're not going to totally get out of all of the things that you might be avoiding. We just might need to change when we're going to take care of some of these different pieces to the extent that you can reduce the access to the technology. Obviously, you don't want a child sitting at home when you're not there, that the child can't get in touch with you, or there's an emergency that they can't do something. So you can't cut off their total access to the world. But if there's a way of cutting off access to certain websites, using some of the different, sort of technology oversight programs that exist that can reduce some of the, some of the free access to, some of the different more enjoyable apps and websites, that's what I would put into place. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So one of the pieces, the reality is that teaching is an incredibly stressful part of, an incredibly stressful piece to be conducting in our current day and world, even without school refusal. School refusal for teachers has really been sort of the tip, has just kind of pushed many teachers to this place of trying to deal with teaching to a classroom with kids who have masks on. So I have no idea if they're listening or not listening, or smiling or not smiling. And now I'm juggling the 4,000 different balls of how to catch these kids up. And now I've got 3 kids in class that aren't coming, and I have to try to participate in some sort of a system here. So I put this slide in there just to ask all of us to be incredibly mindful of the stress that teachers are under during this period of time. Because school refusal is an incredible added stress to teachers, and yet they very much want to work with you to be able to get the kids there. So what is the role of the school team? The role of the school team is to collaborate with the outside clinician and parents, because without doing that, there's no way they're going to be able to help this child back in. And so very often they're the people conducting that functional behavioral assessment, or kind of analyzing what days did the child avoid and what might have been going on those days that would have led the child to do this. They're the ones who help develop an attendance plan, which I'll go through again in a couple of slides. So you can see what is a hierarchy of attendance that helps kids get back into a more typical flow of school. They are often the team that will suggest, okay, your child can't make it here from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. Let's think about the child coming in just at 10 a.m. and staying till lunchtime. And then we go from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., where we delineate which classes are the favorite classes, which are the less preferred classes, and let's focus on getting them to the favored classes first, and then favored class plus 1 difficult class, and then favored class plus 2 difficult classes. So they can often work with you to set up a sequence that can help move past the avoidance by being able to target what are some of the things that might be triggering off the anxiety more significantly. They can set up something where somebody meets the child at the school door to help soothe the child and usher the child into school, so that you're not the one going through that tug of war at the school door, trying to get your child to separate from you, which anyone who's ever worked in a school has seen that on a frequent basis, where you've got the parent trying to get away and the teachers trying to help, and the kids clutching the parent's leg and dragging through the parking lot to try to help that. If we identify who is a preferred member of the team that might be able to come to the school door, soothe the child, kind of distract the child, get them through the threshold, get them into the flow of the day, just to get over that immediate panic that builds up. Providing in-school counseling support. All schools at this point in time have a school team. Some schools obviously are more highly supportive, meaning they've got a lot more resources, some schools less so, but all of the school counselors have training in dealing with school refusal. Bring them onto your team and then coordinate. The school team has to coordinate communication with the teachers, with the counselors, with the parents. And in extreme cases, many schools will send somebody to the home to help build that initial step of getting out of school, out of the house in the morning. So very often, you may be surprised at this, but schools will go that extra mile and send somebody to the home who's got some training to be able to help the child get through this. And so involving the school in this and forming that partnership and not being fearful of allowing the person to be a part of your in-home team can be incredibly helpful as well. And this gets into that bullying piece as well. It's when we are assessing the function of the behavior, if it does seem like there is potentially a bullying situation in place, every public school in Fairfield County and in the state of Connecticut has a very, very detailed school bullying plan to be able to address this in a way that is supportive of the child who is experiencing the bullying, and focused on how do we address the people who might be initiating or maintaining the bullying. And that is obviously the kids involved in it, but also any of the what are called the bystanders in the situation, to really try to work with the bystanders to actually support the child who's having more difficulty and kind of help to stand up to the bully, and to be able to work with the family that is involved, if the family of the child who might be bullying, to provide services that help that child to reduce some of that bullying behavior. The main thing with the bullying, this goes back to your question earlier, the main thing that we as a team need to do, and this is all the people, is in as sensitive a way as possible, in as safe a way as possible, try to give the child the avenue to express that there is a kid or kids that are bothering them or teasing them, or that they're just afraid of, and to be able to really help them to develop a little bit of language around the idea of what's happening, so that we can give that data to the team at school, and there can be an organized plan for how we're going to approach that. Because again, the earlier we develop a plan to address the bullying piece, the better. And it does involve treatment of the child who is avoiding. Very often, the saying, if it takes two to tango, very often you do have the child or the children who are bullying, who have their own possible self-esteem issues or aggression issues, or whatever reason that's triggering them to do the bullying. But you also very often have the child who is extremely sensitive and is extremely predisposed to feeling embarrassment, who needs some help in developing mechanisms to be able to calm themselves in the moment, to build a poker face so that they don't project to the world how overwhelmed they are, and give them some of the basic skills of asserting themselves appropriately without asserting themselves to the point that's going to lead to potentially more provocation. And so working with the child who is getting bullied, not labeling that child as being the one who's got the problem. I'm not trying to blame the victim here, but what I am saying is that that child does need the skills to be able to address this, because what the research is showing is more often than not, they are, without meaning to, they may be projecting a sense of helplessness and overwhelm that can sometimes actually lead to more of this because they become an easy target. So we've got to give them the skills as well, okay? The role of the outside clinician to participate in a thorough assessment of the situation. If they're the ones setting up the plan of dealing with this, the outside clinician must communicate that with the school psychologist, with the school principal, or the person administratively responsible, the school teacher, obviously the parents, and the child. Need to involve the child in understanding what the plan is. Working with the school psychologist to come up with ways to work past the barriers, some of those things that we talked about of having somebody meet the child at the door to separate from the parent, giving support to the parent in the moment. So if the parent is having difficulty at 7:30 in the morning getting the kid out of school, being available to take a phone call to talk the parent through in the moment to help the parent through this. There are a lot of excellent behaviorists in the area. We've got a couple on our staff, but there are a lot of great behaviorists in the area that work specifically with the parents in the moment when the parent is having difficulty getting their child going, getting your child out of the house, that do a quick Zoom session or a quick phone call just to say, okay, do this, and do this, to help the parent in the moment be able to help the child out of the house. Teaching coping strategies like cognitive behavioral therapy. DBT is an acronym for dialectic behavior therapy. These are techniques, as I mentioned, to help calm the system, help work on those maintaining thoughts, those panicky thoughts, to be able to get them under control and to break some of those patterns, and develop a language that everybody's using the same language. The teacher, the school psychologist, the parent, the student, we're all using the same language of what the child's going through, what the child needs to do, so that the child knows we're all working as a team. And so what the child's job is you get out of bed with no more than 3 reminders. You're going to learn your skills to tolerate discomfort. You're going to have to be brave and take some risks, and you're going to have to learn and practice the coping strategies to get through this, okay? So we go through very explicitly, this is the child's role, we got the parent's role, we got the teacher's role, we got the school psychologist's role, we've got the private clinician's role. And so just very briefly, before we run out of time, this is a kid we worked with a couple years ago very successfully. The kid in mid-October was avoiding school pretty much every day. We set up team meetings with the school psychologist, the lead teacher, the grade team. The kid was having panic attacks on a consistent basis. We initiated, with the school's help, a functional behavior analysis. We're able to determine that she was avoiding because of escaping, didn't want to face some of the social things, was feeling, she was going into early adolescence, was having a lot of fears about body image, felt like she was ugly and people were going to tease her. She also had some academic worries. And so we worked with the child and the parents to develop an exposure hierarchy of some steps to get through this. The main goal initially was just get to the building, and then to increase your time in the building, working with the parent in the moment to help the parent so that the parent wasn't feeling overwhelmed by having immediate access to a coach on a daily basis and teaching the student dialectic behavior therapy skills of distress tolerance, mindfulness, working with the school psychologist to support that in school, having sessions during the week. And we're able over the course of about 5 weeks to be able to get a child from 0 attendance in school back to about 95% attendance in school. So I mentioned to you the idea of setting up a hierarchy, and this is a really typical type of hierarchy where what we would do is to intervene in some of these early low distress items to help the child just get to the school parking lot and then walk through the school hallways when there aren't kids there, and then practice drop off, pickup. And then you can see step by step where you're teaching the child to tolerate more distress, teaching the child to get over the threshold, to sit in the situation, be able to practice their techniques, helping the parent to initiate some of these different techniques. The parent is moving the child through these or has somebody to help them drop the child off in the morning. So you can see going through the hierarchy to get to the point of attending a full day of school, work on completing all assigned homework, and at each step of the way, working on all those strategies to give the child that sense of control. And so this is like a daily plan for a student that's unable to attend that shows how to make the day not fun, how to make the day, if you're going to stay at home, it's going to be a day without a lot of reinforcers that you might typically think you're going to have. You're still going to be doing your education and your work. You're still going to be doing physical activity. You're going to be helping me out with activities at home, different types of chores and things like that. And at the end of the day, you're not going to soccer practice. You're not going to taekwondo. You're not going to hang out with your friends or whatever. If you take a day off, you have a full day off. And that means until the next day, and you make it as unenjoyable as possible. So here's like a daily plan that you would set up of what it's going to be like if you do end up staying home and you're working with the school to get their education, get their materials accessible at home so that they can be doing their education, all that sort of stuff. And then at the end of the day, you're working with the child over what worked to help you take a step forward. What were some of the challenges? You might be working with the school psychologist to talk with the child around this, or the private clinician. Okay. So some helpful and unhelpful school accommodations is accepting the absences as excused only based on a medical condition, collaborating with the child, parents, everybody working together, having the option to meet with the school counselor, having the option to identify a hierarchy and work through that hierarchy, but not accepting the anxiety-related excuses, not letting home be too fun, really having as much built in that the child has to do on a typical day that still forces them to sit in their distress and to be able to learn the strategies to focus that, okay? Here's some great resources for you guys, specifically targeted towards caregivers and parents to help in dealing with childhood, adolescent anxiety, how to deal with the cycles of that, as well as has some sections in there for school refusal and dealing with school avoidance. Okay. So thank you all very much. I'm going to stop sharing. I can stay on for a few minutes. Any questions that folks have?
Hi there. I actually have a question. We have a lovely relationship with our school, and we have put in accommodations for our daughter, and it seems like we have a great thing going, but my question is more from the parent side. Is it better or worse during the day? So let's say we had a morning this morning and she went to school. We don't let her stay home. Is it better to check in on her during the day and like via the teacher and email, or is it better to just let it lie from my point of view?
Great question. And that's one of the, very often when you're setting up the hierarchy of how, the different steps the child's going through, the child will identify that, at lunchtime, having a 2-minute phone call with mom just to say hello and make sure everything's okay at home, and also let them know what's going on at school, is a step along the path. Obviously, the long range goal is to get to a place where there's no check-ins. But early on in that process, having a couple of check-ins is sometimes very helpful to give the child the sense of you're on the team with them. And even though they might be at school, you're still kind of with them and still thinking of them. It helps to calm some of that separation fear. The piece I would encourage is that when you do that check-in, if your child starts getting into it's horrible and I'm having such a bad day and I'm not feeling well, can you come pick me up? Or anything that starts going into the, sort of that cycle of I'm overwhelmed and I need you to come rescue me, steer away from that. Say, you've got this. I'm so proud of you. We'll talk more about it later. I'm so proud of you. So great talking to you. I'll talk to you later. Okay. So don't unwittingly or just because you're, you have understandable heartstrings being plucked, don't step in and start giving a lot of a lot of the over nurturant piece of kind of bonding with the anxiety, bond with the strategies of how incredible the child's doing of coping with this.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I have a question. This is Amy. I'd love to hear how you feel or what your take is on a gap year. Just to give you a more specific situation, I have a daughter who's always had anxiety issues. Thought we were doing better. They came to a head last year. I'm curious, based on what you said about exposure and how it's easier in the short term, but to not have to be exposed, but then harder in the long term. I have a feeling that probably aggravated the problem, that she was home. That being said, I've kind of become attracted to this idea of a gap year for her to work on kind of the life skills and the social skills. So not a gap year where she's home, but one where she's doing an internship or that sort of thing, to remove that piece of the performance anxiety, which she has, but is a little lower on her scale than, say, the social anxiety. How do you feel about kind of dividing that up? And
yeah, that's a great question. And I would base the answer on, really on that continuum of how, how challenged is the student in being able to even begin taking some of those initial steps towards a more typical relationship again with school. And so I've worked with a few students over the years who we determined that, they just weren't able to make headway with, with some of the stepwise exposure, getting them back into the school situation. And what would be better would be a more intensive treatment program, whether it be for a semester or for a year. But where during that period of time is a very carefully developed system by which they're going to be developing those skills, like you mentioned, those distress tolerance skills, those coping strategies. They're really working on that. And I would probably, in the ideal world, say that in addition to building those distress tolerance, that they have some other program that they're involved with that still involves some sort of social connection involvement, or some sort of whether I don't know what the age is, but kind of like a giving back type thing, maybe working as an assistant with a weekend program with kids or something, or something that involves a little bit of social interaction, social exposure, normatively typical types of stuff that the person would be doing if they were in the school environment, so that again they're involved in structure, they're involved in healthy activities while they're building some of those coping skills.
okay, yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Any other last questions? I've got to run in about 2 minutes, but any other last questions?
I just want to know, thank you so much. This was all very great, really helpful. What do you think, how can the school best support kids who are being bullied, especially if the bullies are quite good at, sliding under the radar, I guess?
It is, one of the chronic issues obviously is that situation of, where we suspect that there's something going on, and, and then you even set up teachers that are very actively looking for it, and it's like, I'm just not seeing it. We just don't see it. And, of course, if we saw the child engaging in this behavior with one of their peers, we would intervene. And, so sometimes you do find yourself as a parent saying, kind of pulling your hair out, saying, I know my child, I trust my child is telling me the truth that there's bullying going on. And yet, we can't seem to get the school to, it's not that they're not taking it seriously, it's that they don't know exactly where to intervene if they're not seeing the behavior. What I typically do in those situations is, and again, part of this has a little bit of a legal mandate. So I don't know if you know, but the state of Connecticut, many states, but the state of Connecticut has a very, very specific, school bullying mandate. And if there is a report of school bullying that has any credible nature to it, if it's a public school, and most private schools have gotten on board with this as well, it triggers off a whole set of different pieces that the school has to do in terms of investigating, in terms of setting up an intervention plan, a support plan. But, if still they're not necessarily getting to the root of it and addressing the child's issues, what I will, this sometimes feels to parents, again, like blaming the victim, and I'm not doing that at all. But as I said, that's where I will really emphasize on, you as the child who's experiencing this, you have, it is fantastic that you shared this with us. You've taken the risk of making yourself vulnerable and talking about this. Let's really work hard on all of the different strategies that you can do based on the research that are going to be good for you for your whole life. Learning how to assert yourself with people is going to be important for you through your whole life. Learning how to tolerate and just show on the outside that nobody's getting through that external shell is a strategy and a lesson that's going to benefit you through your life. And so by working with the student to make them much more adept at being able to handle things, and to work with the child experiencing this to build a network of, whether it's one other child, two other children, three other children, build a little bit of a network of kind of like a social cohort that is going to be kids that they can feel safe with and bound with, and whether, even if these other kids aren't necessarily standing up to the bully or anything like that, at least the child doesn't feel like they're out on an island all by themselves, that they've got a few kids in their class that they feel are part of their cohort, and really work to build that bond as much as possible. And that's where I've often had success in helping the child to be able to get past this. And then the child who's doing the bullying, if they're doing it to one child, I guarantee that they're going to do it more and more, and there's going to start to be more, more reports of this behavior, so that it does become something that's easier to intervene at. Okay.
Thank you so much for this whole presentation.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and tune into our next one, where Dr. Glass is going to actually even go into much greater detail around exposure, and you as a parent, what you can do, and the research behind exposure treatments for anxiety. Talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.
Just a quick note, we're gonna have the recording and the slides up to all the registrants soon, probably tomorrow. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Chris.
everybody.
Bye-bye.